Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. And now this is usually the part of the intro where I say a date and a year and a specific moment that we are discussing, but we're doing something a little different during the holidays. So this is actually part 1 of a 2-part episode we are doing about the war on Christmas. The idea that Christmas in America is under assault, especially from forces on the cultural and religious left. At this point, talking about the war on Christmas on, say, Fox News is as much of a Christmas tradition as, celebrating Christmas itself. But there are lots of interesting history points along the way, lots of moments to discuss and dates to discuss. So here to do that, as always, is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody. I think we should rename it This Holiday in Esoteric Political History.
Well, there you exactly. And our special guest for this 2-parter is Michael Hobbes, reporter for HuffPost and co-host of the excellent podcast You're Wrong About and Maintenance Phase. Michael, welcome. And I want you to listen very closely to how I greet you. Merry Christmas.
Wow.
Ooh, wow, I feel attacked already.
We don't say that enough anymore.
Wow.
Yeah. But look, if anyone listens to your podcast, they know that you are a connoisseur of moral panics and media freakouts, so I think this is the perfect fit for you. So thank you for doing this.
Yeah, you're hitting all my buttons. This is great. This is the war on Christmas. I'm into it.
That's right.
Exactly. So look, here, listeners, here's how we're going to structure this. Part 1, which is this part right now, we're going to look at, let's call it the modern war on Christmas. It's the phenomenon that's popped up in, say, the last 15 years or so. So that's going to be part 1, 2004 to today. And then part 2 is going to go back in time into the 20s, 30s, 40s. We'll look at the war on Christmas and how it was really percolating and reflected through a lot of the 20th century and even earlier. But here on part 1, and for you purists out there who demand that this podcast be hooked to a specific date, here is your date, December 7th, 2004, which was the night that Bill O'Reilly first aired a segment on Fox News called Christmas Under Siege. And that night he told his viewers, quote, all over the country, Christmas is taking flack. So let's call this the Fort Sumter of the war on Christmas. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of the war on Christmas. This is where it all started. Nikki, take us to 2004, that segment on Bill O'Reilly. What was he up to?
2004. So America and Bill O'Reilly were both on a wartime footing, right? We're just about a year into the war in Iraq, and a little post-election holiday programming. So George W. Bush had just won re-election, and Bill O'Reilly pivoted away from the election, away from all of those culture war attacks on gay marriage that had been such a big part of the 2004 election, to a new culture war, which is the war on Christmas. And he launches it, like you said, Christmas Under Siege, by all of those radical liberals who want you to stop saying Merry Christmas.
And he sort of pulls together a bunch of different anecdotes from around the country. So he talks about how there were no religious floats in the holiday parade in Denver, and how in New York City, Michael Bloomberg, who was mayor at the time, unveiled a holiday tree, not a Christmas tree. And that Macy's had told people to say Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas. So it was kind of, pulling together these strands and turning it into primetime programming, Michael.
I'm like giggling over here because it's very interesting to me how we, of course we keep having the same sort of right-wing freakouts over this, but it's interesting that the war on Christmas depends on the idea that sort of non-Christmas havers are deeply oversensitive, right? That if you say Merry Christmas to somebody who doesn't celebrate Christmas, that they're going to like freak out and like start throwing things and like throw a tantrum in the Target. And then on the other hand, you also have Fox News defending this absurd hypersensitivity about the fact that some random city in some random place is having a holiday tree rather than a Christmas tree. Like, there is nothing more hypersensitive and snowflakey than caring about what the Denver City Hall Christmas light celebration actually is. And so it's just this weird duality where it's like, we have to be hypersensitive because these outgroups are so hypersensitive.
That twist you describe is really interesting. It's like, what is, I think, often thought of as accommodation gets turned into persecution, right? So
Yes.
It is accommodating of different beliefs to say we're going to have a holiday season, but in fact it is then thought of as something more actively against Christianity.
Right. There's I think embedded in a lot of these freakouts is this slippery slope to totalitarianism argument that you're getting right now with sort of trans people pronouns thing, like you should use the correct pronouns for people, and like, you're restricting my speech, you want to throw me in the gulag, all of this sort of heightened language around it, where it's just, it's not illegal to say Merry Christmas to people, but this somehow got cast as some sort of restriction on speech or some sort of like totalitarian creep by all these outgroups that really don't have the power to implement that kind of agenda anyway.
Yeah, and there was a real attack on corporations as well. So you have like these random examples of towns where they don't have a Christmas crush that year or they have a holiday tree. But then there is this, that sort of sensitivity that you're talking about, Mike, is transmuted into this like large attack that has to be stopped on the front line. So you see things where Walmart and Target and Sears are all being boycotted for using like happy holidays in their advertising circular for Christmas. And so just the absence of a Merry Christmas, even when it's being said all the time in these stores, leads to these very targeted economic actions against all of these big box stores who are seen as somehow being involved in this web of persecution.
Yeah, I mean, Christmas is a holiday. This was one of the things that I never got about it. When they say happy holidays, like, you're one of the holidays. They're not saying like Christmas. Happy Kwanzaa and nobody else. Like, they're saying happy holidays. There's a bunch of holidays. Take whichever one you want.
You know, I do want to get to some of the things you're talking about, Nikki, of how this fits into larger, I think, cultural fears, not just specific religious conversation. I do want to take one moment, though, as we're talking about this Bill O'Reilly's week of programming, to just acknowledge the like enterprising nature of primetime TV programming that this is. And, you know, I used to be a producer on a daily talk show. And, you know, part of me like recognizes what's going on here, which is, you know, part of your job is to sit around in an editorial meeting and be like, oh, there's this thing over here and there's this thing over here and there's, oh my gosh, here's a trend and we can brand this. We can do a 5-part series, you know, and that's not always bad. I mean, that's sort of part of the job of journalists, is to see patterns and frame stuff for people. Here, I think, you know, we'll get into this, a bit of an agenda, but I just kind of like, in going back and revisiting this week of Bill O'Reilly programming, I saw a very enterprising associate producer somewhere in some room who hopefully got a raise, because this was probably very successful programming. But, you know, there is that element to it as well.
Well, this to me, actually, I mean, I've done a lot of work recently on misinformation and sort of fake news going around online and conspiracy theories, et cetera. And I actually think that the War on Christmas model of disinformation is much more pernicious and much more difficult to deal with than the sort of straightforward conspiracy, kids drinking, you know, Satanists drinking the blood of children type conspiracies, because everything that Bill O'Reilly was talking about on his show was true. So it's not misinformation, right? Like, I'm sure that the Denver City Hall, whatever, really was a holiday tree that year. So you can't really crack down on it as misinformation. It's just taking anecdotes out of context. And I think it's just a huge, like, I don't think we've figured this out yet. The problem is it's a really big country, and basically an example of everything happens every day. And so what are the ethics of sort of cherry picking these examples that don't suit any trends? Like, they're not actually indicative of anything, but you can find 5 examples of anything anywhere at all times and turn them into a story.
And those stories are more visible now thanks to nonstop cable news programming and the content mills of social media.
And we'll see as we go through the last 15 years or so how much I think social media has a big part in just amplifying small things, and then it becomes this, it spins up. Other stuff that's bubbling around the time, Nikki, I mean, well, for one, we had Peggy Noonan is a sort of big name in all of this. So she's writing columns, and I think she wrote a thing about how her neighbors, I'm just going to go out on a limb and assume she lives on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. That her neighbors, were like upset with her Virgin Mary display, and so she writes some columns there. And then there's a book in 2005 by a man named John Gibson called "The War on Christmas: How the Liberal Plot to Ban the Sacred Christian Holiday is Worse Than You Thought." And of course, he then goes on Bill O'Reilly, and there's this sort of feedback loop there. So I don't know, paint a picture there, and I guess let's start to answer this question of how much this is a cultural freakout and how much this is about religion.
Sure. So one thing that you need to know about John Gibson and his book is that John Gibson had been a Fox News anchor since 2000. He was already part of the Fox News machine. And so he goes on Bill O'Reilly and amplifies something that O'Reilly was already doing, which was this idea of a war on Christmas. It pretty quickly becomes a phenomenon at that point because the O'Reilly had so many viewers that it was able to catapult this up in the Amazon rankings in 2005. All of a sudden, the Google search trends for War on Christmas start to spike, and it gets into kind of not just the zeitgeist, but it becomes part of cultural conservative identity in the United States, in part because by the mid-2000s, there is a conservative media ecosystem that is unlike anything we'd ever seen. So Fox News had started in 1996. In 2002, it becomes the most watched cable news network. But in the period from 2000 to 2002 is when you get all of these new conservative talk radio programs. This is when you get like wall-to-wall conservative talk radio. And this kind of stuff is like catnip to radio hosts. And that's how it begins to like spread rapidly all across the country.
There's also something interesting here about, in some ways, like the triumph of progressive discourse, that from the civil rights movement onward, you had activists that were basically promoting the idea that there is discrimination and there is inequality and there is oppression in the world. And that idea got so entrenched that right-wingers and Christians and white people and all of these groups that just objectively are not oppressed took on that language. But then ever since we've had that triumph, we've had this nonstop march of, my favorite one is every time you propose like a bike lane in a city, people will talk about the war on cars. Like, we're in the middle of a war on cars. And it's like 80% of Americans drive to work. There's no war on cars. But like, that's the framing of like, I as a driver, 80% of the population am oppressed, right? And so this has become an obsession for really every majoritarian movement that we have in this country.
You just described the last, 60 years of American politics, the sort of like democratization of victimhood, right?
Yes.
I mean, that is kind of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the religious angle of this is really important because what Mike's talking about is, there's a through line in American politics, especially among the religious right, of this fear of secularization. And this goes back to the 1960s, taking prayer out of schools, that sort of fear that Christian supremacy in the United States is no longer going to exist, that it is going to be treated the same as all other religions. And that gets taken as an attack on Christianity or a war on Christianity. And you see that in all sorts of things. I mean, here we're talking about Christmas, but remember the big to-do over the 10 Commandments in an Alabama courthouse. I mean, these fights are all of a piece. And one reason why we continue to see them is because they're so effective. I mean, that's the front line now. Now that marriage equality is legal across the United States, now it's about religious freedom and the ability to discriminate against gay people because of your religion. And so that framework of religious liberty has been an incredibly powerful opening in Christian right politics over the past 20 years.
I do want to layer in one other element here, though, because around 2005 is where now The Daily Show starts to become, I think, a big factor in this conversation. And so, maybe a year or two after this is bubbling up on Fox News, now we have The Daily Show, which I think is a pretty significant cultural force. They start to pick up the war on Christmas as something they talk about a lot. And now we have this kind of other element of the mocking of the war on Christmas as a significant part of this story. And, it fits into what I would say is like probably a mutually beneficial project here, where Fox gets to talk about the war on Christmas and The Daily Show and Comedy Central and their audience gets to mock that. And at some level, everyone kind of wins.
Everybody makes a lot of money. I mean, this is the sort of a high era of Jon Stewart and then Stephen Colbert. Stephen Colbert, who is directly modeled after Bill O'Reilly, is this kind of mocking figure, and a real boon in political entertainment. I mean, the 1990s and the 2000s were like the high tide of politics as entertainment. And The Daily Show, Bill O'Reilly rivalry was a huge part of that, because it not only makes Bill O'Reilly watchers more sensitive to any sign that Christmas is under attack, but it makes Jon Stewart's viewers more sensitive to anyone complaining about Christmas being under attack. And so you have that kind of mutually beneficial relationship that maybe isn't culturally that helpful.
It also adds to the idea that we're under attack, right? Because there's an entire TV show on Comedy Central that is making fun of us. And so that just contributes to that narrative.
Just amps up the temperature, for sure.
But can I ask, do you guys think that was a mistake, The Daily Show, to sort of go in on making fun of right-wing snowflakes?
No, I don't really think so. I mean, I think the constant question these days is the question of amplification versus ignoring. So on the one hand, you could say, well, yeah, it was amplifying it and making it a bigger deal and sort of drawing it out even more, that these entertainers were talking about this topic year after year after year. But we were also in a media moment in the mid-2000s when straight news outlets were not going to attack the war on Christmas lest they look liberal. Right. And so in a way, like, Stewart was probably one of the few voices out there that was going to call the war on Christmas idea a sham.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think this falls into pretty clear, you should punch up, not punch down territory. And I think Fox was big enough that even Comedy Central and Jon Stewart going after them, that's punching up. I think there's a lot of punching down that happens, especially with social media, where you pluck something, and it happens from the left all the time. You pluck something and you make fun of it, and in fact, you're amplifying it. But I think Fox News was a big enough of a force that it needed that counterweight for sure.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the role of corporations, Nikki, you mentioned here, and how a lot of these sort of freakouts or concerns were around corporate language and corporate moves. So one is, in 2015, there's a big hubbub about the Starbucks cups. So Starbucks for many years had done holiday cups. A lot of them often, I don't know if they ever had like Christmas stuff on them specifically, but they often had, trees or snowflakes or other snowflakes or other things.
Christmas-ish.
Yes. But in 2015, they're just red cups with a green Starbucks logo, and that's their holiday cup. And, people are not happy about this, and they see this as, again, encroachment and cowing and Starbucks being overly PC. There was a pastor, actually, who posted a video that got millions and millions of views where he claims that he went into Starbucks and gave his name as Merry Christmas so that he forced Starbucks to wish him a Merry Christmas, and he really caught them off guard. But that said, I think the fears about corporations are really interesting because we have culture wars in this country. We have geographic differences in this country. If you live in, one part of the country, you can, let's say the South, and you're in a conservative area, you can point to New York and be like, New York liberals are doing this. And people in New York can point to the South and be like, look at what's happening. But corporations are everywhere. Walmart is everywhere. Macy's is everywhere. Starbucks is everywhere. So I think that I get that a lot of this sort of came down to companies and corporations, because that's where you get these, I think, at some level, genuine concerns about changing cultural norms.
Yeah, I mean, corporations are always interesting in the conversation around particularly conservative cultural politics, because there is a real drive for corporations not to offend anyone and to reach out to groups that they think might come and give them their money. And so they don't want to be exclusive. They want to be inclusive. And there was certainly a change over the course of particularly like the 1990s and 2000s, where there was an effort to model their language in such a way that would be as inclusive as possible. And that meant saying things like Happy Holidays, because it was an era in which more and more people were celebrating holidays like Kwanzaa. It was a period in which there was just more recognition of how exclusive some language could be. And so you have these corporations like Starbucks trying to find the best way to be both festive and to be inclusive. Now, look, a red and green cup is Christmassy. Those are Christmas colors.
Dude, it's Christmas. Yes.
I know.
Yeah.
It's like I'm drinking a gingerbread latte out of this cup.
Yes.
We are celebrating Christmas.
Yeah.
But, Starbucks in particular had emerged as this bogeyman of corporate liberalism. And so it became a target, I think even more so than, say, Target, or certainly Walmart, which found itself very shocked to be under attack in this way.
All right, Mike, you're in Seattle. What do you have to say about your hometown?
As the CEO of Starbucks, I regret not having baby Jesus on all the cups, which is what we used to have. I mean, I love tracing this in parallel with the rise of the moral panic over cancel culture, right? Because now the right is freaked out about college sophomores, boycotting whatever, the new James Charles palette because they're mad at him, or whatever cancel culture even means. But then the war on Christmas was objectively cancel culture. You're having a list of corporations that you're telling people not to buy from. I personally think all of that stuff is fine. I think it's fine to boycott a company for dumb reasons, good reasons, have a blast. But it's also just weird that we have these two completely contradictory ideas at the same time. I also think that it's, embedded in the critique of cancel culture is this idea of liberal arts colleges and super left-wing cultural race theory professors gone too far. And yet, at the same time, the idea that saying happy holidays to someone is a personal attack, it's this is exactly what they're accusing Oberlin sophomores of doing. This is looking at the symbolism of a red cup and seeing it as an attack. It doesn't get more critical theory PhD than that.
So one other moment we should talk about on our tour here is in 2013, right in the thick of all of this, Aisha Harris writes a piece at Slate where it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, I don't know, but she writes an idea saying that Santa is passé and that we should come up with new tropes for Christmas, and she says maybe we should have a penguin as the avatar of Christmas, and it makes the rounds on Twitter and so forth. And then Megyn Kelly, who at this point, right, 2013, is a Fox News primetime anchor, is that right?
Yes.
Nikki? So Megyn Kelly picks it up and has her famous moment, which goes very viral, where she basically says, Santa is white. And she just sort of asserts that. I think it's in a chyron. And so I think we just have to acknowledge that moment as well. I don't know if that tells us anything new.
Look, it's an important moment in the history of Megyn Kelly. And, about how much is invested in how we think about Christmas. If you're that attached to the idea that Santa Claus has to look the same way Santa Claus looked when you were a kid, or something is being taken away from you, I think it's just the essence of that idea. It's well, of course Santa is white. Santa's always been white. And if you change that, you've taken something from my childhood and you've taken something from me.
I mean, race is an interesting aspect of this because
yes.
I think Fox News was very, in some ways that's very canny. I don't think they were doing this deliberately necessarily. But when you talk about who is offended by Merry Christmas, who are the groups in society that do not celebrate Christmas? It is Jews, it is Black people who celebrate Kwanzaa, and it is atheists. To create this specter. Exactly. It's the perfect little trifecta of who is going to be destroying Christmas, who is going to be taking this away from you. Conveniently, it happens to be an ethnic minority and this group that is always a sort of out-group, in-group, insider, George Soros, the target of conspiracy theories for hundreds of years. And then you've got atheists who are dragging the country down into this godless hellhole, right? It's the perfect way to attack those three groups without seeming like you're attacking those three groups.
All right, well, let's start to wrap up here and maybe bring it to now. And I guess, there are some interesting examples bubbling up now, but tell me if you feel the same way. I kind of feel like I'm hearing a little less about this. And maybe that's because there are other wars being waged, or maybe it's died away in some way, or maybe I'm wrong, and maybe the war on Christmas is still out there. What's your sense, Mike?
I actually found this week, or maybe it was last week, a story on Fox News that has made the Facebook rounds about somebody who wrote a letter to one of their neighbors who put up a bunch of Christmas lights. And this person wrote, look, it's 2020. It's been a really rough year. A lot of people are suffering. It's a little bit insensitive for you to have these big, expensive lights right now. I think that it's, racially insensitive. I think you shouldn't do it. Please take your lights down. Which is honestly a pretty weird and oversensitive letter to write to your neighbor. But it's also like, it's just one person writing a slightly oversensitive letter to their neighbor in a random place in America, and yet this became like this massive thing in right-wing media circles.
It was in St. Anthony, Minnesota. Yeah, I'm finding it right now, but yes, I hadn't heard of that one.
But it showed to me, anyway, the way that, because I searched Fox News' website this morning and I couldn't actually find any mentions of the war on Christmas in quotes from 2020. Like, this seems like something that has sort of faded away, but it's been replaced by this sort of racial justice warrior. That this is now the specter, rather than people who don't want you to say Merry Christmas to them. It's now sort of Black Lives Matter activists. It's now Antifa. It's now whatever else. But it's exactly the same thing, right? They're telling you that you can't have Christmas lights up, and it's the same structure of, it's basically a meaningless anecdote that happened somewhere in America. Like, I'm sure thousands of kind of weird letters get sent neighbor to neighbor every day, and yet this one has been plucked out and turned into a national story. So to me, it just proves that, like, this is all still here. It just morphed into this new target.
Yeah. We should say that in 2016, Bill O'Reilly declared that the war on Christmas had been won because Donald Trump was elected president, and he was going to allow us all to say Merry Christmas again.
And Trump says that all the time, right? We're going to say Merry Christmas again, and so forth. But Michael, I like your way of framing this as, you know, a manifestation of a pattern of thinking and of media, and that can jump to different eras and different topics for sure. I will say, though, that in 2020, this pattern and this sort of way of thinking about the world has picked up, as you were saying, Black Lives Matter and those issues. It has also picked up COVID. And I just yesterday saw a tweet from Representative Jim Jordan that reads, "Dr. Fauci says you can't see your kids at Christmas. We knew he'd try to cancel it." So there you have the war on Christmas, anti-COVID stuff, and, you know, this sort of hatred of Dr. Fauci. It still lives in this metastasized form.
If Dr. Fauci went to Oberlin, then you just get the whole trifecta in there. That would be perfect.
Yeah.
The war on Christmas is back, baby.
I suppose so. Do you have any thoughts on that, or should we just let Jim Jordan have the final word? Oh, God. Someone rescue this podcast. All right, well, we will leave it there then. Michael Hobbes, thank you so much for doing this, and you'll be back next episode for the deep roots of the war on Christmas. So thanks again.
Thanks for including me in your battalion.
And Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
Once again, we will be back next episode. That's on Thursday, our second part of our special on the war on Christmas. In the meantime, if you are not a listener to You're Wrong About, you should absolutely go and check it out. They are releasing new episodes now. Go into the archives. It's one of our favorite shows. So go and check that out in the day between now and our next episode, and we'll see you here on Thursday. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. And that phrase, listener-supported, is a big part of this show. If you would like to support the show directly, go to thisdaypod.com if you are in a position to do so, or just spread the word about this show. Thank you to everyone who has helped spread the word about this show. You can also just get in touch with any questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes. There's a form at thisdaypod, or you can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. We post transcripts to every episode. Those are done by Kala Nakua. Thank you, Kala. You can find the link to those at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Abergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.